Lecture 12, Greek and Norse Pantheons.
In this lecture, we start a new unit, this one on gods and goddesses. In some ways, gods and goddesses are sort of the sine qua non of mythology. That is, if there weren't gods and goddesses, we wouldn't have myths. Because any dictionary definition that you look up will probably tell you that myths are primarily stories about gods and goddesses. What we want to do in this lecture is first to define God and goddess in the way that we'll be using these terms in the myths that we talk about in future lectures, and then to give a very brief account of the ways in which human apprehension of gods and goddesses change over time. And then we want to take a look at two pantheons. Literally, a pantheon means all gods, but the word is almost always used to refer to the gods and goddesses of a culture considered collectively. And we could learn a lot about the function of gods and goddesses by taking a look at the structures of which they're part. We'll use the Greek pantheon to start off with, primarily because it's very familiar. It's one that we probably know something about already. And then we'll move to the Norse mythology, the Norse pantheon, whose creation and destruction myths we looked at in the last unit. Okay, gods and goddesses. David Adams Leeming, in a book called The World of Myth, gives a fairly complex definition of god and goddess to begin his book. He says gods and goddesses are immortal beings who are personified projections of the human mythmaker's dream of overcoming the inevitable effects of the physical laws that require death and disintegration. Notice he says that gods and goddesses are projections of the human mythmaker's dream. He doesn't necessarily mean that they're not real, only that we use them as a way of coming to terms ourselves with our own contingency. He adds to that Mircea Eliade's definition of gods and goddesses as what Eliade calls fecundators, that is, those powerful creative forces that are always struggling against the tendency toward chaos and entropy that we treated in our first unit. We know that gods and goddesses are also metaphors for relationships in human society. Zeus is a patriarch and a husband, a philandering one at that, and Hera is a wife and a mother, very often a jealous one. And the Olympian hierarchies in this sort of way mirror those of Greek families at the time that these pantheons came into existence. We know that gods and goddesses are also personifications of certain aspects of nature or of human nature, so that gods and goddesses represent the sun, the wind, anger, love. And gods and goddesses probably also give us a kind of, provide for us kind of symbols of an ultimate reality, giving us a sense of significance in what could otherwise be a meaningless world. Because there are gods and goddesses, we have meaning, we have a reason for being. We are given responsibilities by those gods. We name the animals, we guard nature, we do the things that they ask us to do. This is not in Leeming, but in our own age, myths are read probably more often psychologically than cosmologically, and deity archetypes, and we'll see this in future lectures, can help us explore our own inner cosmos to allow us to function better as integrated personalities instead of fragmented ones. As I said, we'll come back to this and do much more of this later. Roy Willis, in his introduction to his world mythology, says that there is a kind of way in which the apprehension of the gods changes for humans over time. As he points out, in the earliest days, the gods and goddesses are thought of usually as sort of abstract forces, something like the great mystery or the absolute. The first concrete embodiments of gods and goddesses are almost always in some kind of animal form, typically a serpent. A serpent might be the source of all energy in the cosmos. It might also be the source of the destructive forces. And it might hold the universe together. It might also be the cause of the universe's destruction. And we've seen both of those functions in the Norse myths that we looked at last time. Next, we have personifications of deities who are probably part animal and part human. And we've seen a number of those in Egyptian mythology. If they're not pictured as half human, half animal, then they might very well be pictured as giants. And we've already seen this in the pictures of deities like Ymir and Panku. Only later in history do these forces lose their monstrous qualities. And then when they do, they become departmentalized. They become male and female. They're put in charge of specific kind of functions. At this point, the gods become more like us. They're anthropomorphized, and then each one takes on a specific function. There's a god of music, there's a god of love, there's a god of war, there's a god of hospitality, there's a god of, or goddess of the fertility of crops. As people moved from nomadic life to settled agricultural life, more and more of these gods and goddesses took on the specific functions of fertility. And as we'll see that in our next lectures, to see how fertility gods and goddesses become extraordinarily important at the time of the agricultural revolution. Sometimes a god would take over each of the four cardinal directions. Sometimes the three realms of heaven, earth, and the underworld would be given over to individual gods. And at that point, once there are enough gods around and they all have separate responsibilities, the need to understand their relationships becomes crucial. And that's where pantheons come in. We'll start with the Greek, as we said, because we all probably know something about the Greek pantheon to begin with. The most of the information we have about the Greek pantheon comes from Hesiod's Theogony, from the Homeric hymns, and from Homer's epic poems. And all of them have the kind of historic progression built into them that Willis talks about that we went through just a moment ago. In the story as we have it, Gaia is the oldest of all of the deities. She is Mother Earth. She was the one who first emerged from chaos. She generated out of herself a mate, Uranos, and then mated with him. Among their offspring are Kronos and Rhea and the giants, the Titans. And Uranos then, as a kind of effort to try to hold on to his power, tries to prevent his children from being born. What he does is he conceives the children on Gaia, but then forces her to keep them inside herself so that they can never see the light of day. Cronus, when he eventually overthrows his father, it happens anyway, Uranos does get overthrown, and when Cronus then mates with Rhea, he tries to do the same thing. This time what he insists on doing is swallowing each one of his children just as soon as they're born, so it can't grow up to displace him. Cronus, this Cronus does succeed in deposing Uranos, and Zeus succeeds in deposing Cronus, both again with the help of their mothers, who ally themselves with their sons against their husbands. Uranos is in fact emasculated by Cronus as part of that story. So Zeus, by the time we get to Zeus and his family, the pantheon we know best, we're really at the third generation of gods. And there is a progression from Uranos to Cronus to Zeus, which illustrates that perception of the gods outlined by Willis. The final stage might also suggest a kind of shift from earth-centered gods to sky gods, who are inevitably patriarchal, and we'll come back and talk more about that in future lectures. The Greek pantheon is organized as a family, as an aristocratic family with unlimited power, so its structure reflects the structure of an aristocratic family in Greece at the time. Zeus won his position by a long war against his father and the Titans, and his position by the time of the pantheon is pretty secure. By his wife, who is of course also his sister, he was the father of Ares and Hephaestus and two minor goddesses. By other goddesses and mortal women, he was the father of Persephone and Athena and Aphrodite and Apollo and Artemis and Hermes and Dionysus. Zeus's brothers are Poseidon and Hades. Poseidon took over as lord of the sea, and Hades became lord of the underworld. That's the way they divided up their responsibilities. His sisters are Hera and Demeter and Hestia. By Demeter, Zeus becomes the father of Persephone, and her story, which also involves her uncle Hades, we'll come back and visit in Lecture 27. Each god or goddess had a certain area of responsibility. Athena was the goddess of wisdom and to some extent the goddess of war. Demeter was the goddess of grain and other fruits of the earth. Ares was the raging god of war. Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty and love. Each one of these gods and goddesses generated a whole lot of stories and myths of his or her own exploits and adventures. And that's a rich subject all by itself. In fact, there is another teaching company course taught by Professor Vanderveer called Classical Mythology, which goes into many of those individual stories, and which I highly recommend to you. The relationships inside this pantheon, this familial structure, are all the kind of relationships you run across in families. Everyone is related to everyone else, and there are even generations in the pantheon. Apollo is always portrayed as youthful. Zeus and Poseidon are portrayed as more middle-aged. They have beards usually. They have more mature-looking bodies than those of Hermes or Ares. Demeter is Persephone's mother, and while Demeter is, of course, still immortally beautiful, she is still always pictured as a generation older than her own daughter Persephone, or a generation older than Athena or Aphrodite. Both the family relationships and the generational ones help to account for the ways the gods behave toward each other. In them, we can see the kind of immortal pecking order on the top of Mount Olympus. The divine family also reflects the ways families were structured and behaved on earth, since we always have to picture the gods in terms of our own experience. What's really notable in this Greek story is the amazing amount of hostility among the males of the first, second, and third generation. Uranos, as we said, confines his children Gaia in her womb so that they can't escape. She plots with Cronus to castrate Uranos one time when he enters her, and then Cronus, in his turn, swallows all of his children as they're born by Rhea, so they won't be able to grow up and depose him. When Zeus is born, according to the story, Rhea wraps a stone in swaddling clothes, and Cronos swallows that, thinking that he's swallowing the child. That gives her a chance to spirit Zeus away to Crete, where he grows up and then can come back and depose his own father. The same fears occurred in the next generation and were narrowly averted. Zeus's first wife was a goddess named Metis, but he had been told in a prophecy that she would give birth to a daughter who would equal him in wisdom and to a son who would depose him. So that when she was pregnant the first time, according to the story, Zeus simply swallows her. He simply makes her disappear. She was pregnant at the time with Athena, and Athena then, according to the story, is born from the head of Zeus, full-blown from the head of Zeus, and it does turn out that she is the goddess of wisdom. She does turn out, the prophecy's right, she turns out to be as wise as Zeus is. The son, who might have deposed him, of course, is never conceived, and so that's that. Metis spends the rest of her time inside of Zeus, where, as he says, she still gives him good advice. She was always very wise, and she gives him a lot of great advice which he can use in dealing with the problems that he comes across. So the question is, why in this story, why is there so much hostility? Why is there so much violence? For those of us who are post-Freudians, it sounds very Oedipal to us, fathers and sons. We know that story, and it happens all the time. And there's probably some truth to that. There's probably some Freudian elements that go into this story. But there are also probably some social and economic ones. Philip Slater has a book called The Glory of Hera, which is about family relationships in Greek mythology. And he says that he thinks the tensions in those mythical stories reflect the economic and social tensions in an aristocratic Greek family of the time. As he points out, Greek men didn't usually marry till they were established, which meant they were usually in their 30s when they became married. Women were married when they reached puberty, which would have been about 13 or 14, and they'd probably not been educated outside the house. So as Slater says, these women would have been closer in maturity and experience to their children than they would have been to their husband. And it's probably not surprising that they always take their son's side against their father's. Also, as Slater points out, when there's no war going on or no chance for a son to have some extraordinary adventure, a man had to wait until his father died to come into his inheritance to find his place in society. So this may explain in part the son's impatience to replace the father and some of the violence in those stories of the first three generations of the Greek gods. So that's a kind of brief snapshot of the Greek pantheon. We've seen the structure, we've seen the relationship among the deities. We understand that there is a gradual growth in our conception of the gods over time, and we understand that in many ways these pantheons will reflect our own concerns and values. Another really interesting pantheon is the one that comes from the Germanic peoples of Northern Europe. We've already looked at their creation and destruction myths in the past unit. Now we'd like to take a brief look at the gods and goddesses who live inside those myths. The Norse pantheon is partly familial, but it's mostly organized around the structure of a cosmic tree, an axis mundi, one of those things that links worlds together. The cosmic tree in Norse mythology is called Yggdrasil, the world ash tree. It's located at the very center of the world. Its roots reach all the way down to the underworld. And beneath the roots is a spring, which is the source of great hidden wisdom. Odin, the father of the gods, once gave one of his eyes for a taste of water from that spring. There's a squirrel that runs up and down the trunk carrying messages between an eagle at the top and a serpent at the bottom that is always gnawing at the roots of the tree. There's a deer that feeds on the branches, and out of the antlers of that deer flow the great rivers of the world. There's a goat that grazes there too, and that goat yields not milk, but mead for the warriors of Valhalla, Odin's great hall, as the warriors prepare themselves for that final battle with giants and monsters. Asgard is the home of two groups of gods, the Aesir, who are sky gods, and the Vanir, who are earth gods. The Vanir have another home underneath the earth, but they spend a lot of their time in Asgard. In the tree's roots is a place called Jotunheim, where the giants live, and below them is the land of the dead, which is ruled over by Hel, the daughter of Loki. In other parts of the tree, there are other worlds that contain the elves and the dwarves and the Norns. Norns are something like the Greek fates. Then the tree connects all of these worlds, holds them all together, and there are bridges between all parts of them. One of the bridges is, the most famous one is Bifrost, which is either the rainbow or the Milky Way. Midgard, where humans live, is in the middle of all these worlds. There are many different kinds of beings in these places. This is not a nuclear family, and the relationships among them are full of strife. Odin is the ruler of Asgard, as Zeus is of Olympus, except that Odin never has Zeus's control. He's never as in charge as Zeus is. He seems to have evolved from a couple of Germanic war gods, so he's still very much involved with battle. He gives gifts of swords to princes and warriors, and he's responsible for the ecstasy that possesses those berserkers, those people who work themselves into a frenzy and get so frenzied that they go into battle without body armor, and they are also so frenzied that they don't even know when they've been wounded. He's also responsible for the inspiration of poets, and I've always found this interesting, that the inspiration for the berserkers and the inspiration of poets comes from the same place and is the same kind of inspiration. In the myth that's told to explain this, when the Aesir and the Vanir have concluded a peace, they've just finished a long war, they all spit into the same vessel and thereby create a very wise giant. Later, the dwarves kill that giant and mix his blood with honey, making a really potent magic mead. A giant whose parents had been killed by dwarves steals the mead, and then Odin has to go out to recover it. And there are a long series of adventures, but he does manage to do it. What he does is he swallows the entire batch, and then he flies back to Asgard as an eagle. So the gods eventually get it back. But on the way, some of it spills out of his mouth, and wherever some of it spills, it becomes the inspiration of poets and great speakers. So the inspiration, both for the warriors who fight and for the poets who sing their praises, comes ultimately from the same place and is the same kind of inspiration. Odin is also the god of magic and divination. Seems to have been a time when human sacrifices were given to him. Captured prisoners would be hanged, and people watched the last twitchings of these victims because it was understood that this is one of the ways that Odin communicated, told us what it was that he wanted us to do. Odin could be extremely treacherous. His ultimate agenda is to preserve Asgard and to hold the cosmos together so that he could abandon warriors when it wasn't in his interest that they win. And so sometimes in the middle of the battle, he would simply go off and support somebody else because his agenda would be better served there than here. And so in his cults, he was more feared than loved, probably. His creatures were the wolf and the raven, who are also creatures of the battlefield. They're the ones who devour the slain. And his two ravens each day fly around the entire world and bring him news from everything that's happening all over the world. Odin is also something of a shaman in his ability to change shapes and travel across all three worlds. In a shamanistic myth, he once hangs upon a tree for 9 days to learn magic runes, which are ancient letters that contain information about the cosmos, past, present, and future. He undergoes a kind of shamanistic, symbolic death in what turns out to be an initiation ceremony in that myth. His Valkyries collect the souls of slain warriors and bring them back to Valhalla, his warrior hall, where they spend their days eating and drinking and fighting. Those killed each day in battle are revived each night so that they can eat, drink, and fight again. And all of these are always preparing for Ragnarok, when the gods and the human warriors will fight against the giants and the monsters. And that's a myth that we looked at in our first unit. As we said, Odin was probably more venerated than loved by Germanic peoples. And he's also, in a way, in all of the myths that are told about him, he's also in a way partly responsible for bringing down Asgard and ending the world. But he was definitely a force to be reckoned with. We still remember him. We commemorate in one of our days of the week. Odin's Day, or Wotan's Day, or Wednesday is still Wotan, still his day. Odin's wife was Frigg, and she was very different from Hera. Mostly she was a devoted wife and mother who doesn't protest very much at Odin's relationship with other women, which in any case were not motivated usually by lust, but by some part of his large plan to keep Asgard and the universe together. Her one great myth involves her son with Odin, a son named Balder, who is always called the finest, the best, the most beautiful of the gods of the Aesir. Balder at one point starts having bad dreams. And Frigg begins to worry about what those bad dreams mean, what they're all about. So what she does is she goes out through the entire world and gets a promise from everything, every creature, everything, that it will not harm Balder. Once she has elicited this promise, he seems safe, invulnerable. Nothing can harm him now. Everything's promised not to hurt him. And so the gods spend their time, one of their recreations at their big parties is that they throw all manner of things at Balder, knowing that nothing will hurt him. So they could throw spears and rocks and arrows and whatever they want. Nothing harms him because he is invulnerable because of the promise of his mother. Loki, however, the trickster, manages to elicit from Frigg that she had not gotten a promise from one thing, the mistletoe. She had considered the mistletoe to be too young to cause harm, and so she had not elicited a promise from the mistletoe. So of course, at the next banquet, Loki gets a blind god to fling a mistletoe spear at Balder, and of course it kills him. And that's the end of the fairest, the best, the most beautiful of all of these gods. Balder gets memorialized in the story in a great ship burial, like the one that we know from Sutton Hoo. Meanwhile, Frigg, not wanting to give up yet, sends one of Balder's brothers to the land of the dead, to Hel, to see if Balder can be recovered. Hel tells him that he can return to life if everything and every creature on earth will mourn for him. All do, even the trees and the rocks weep. As the poet says, the way the earth weeps when a thaw comes after a great frost. But there's one giantess in a cave who refuses. She says, "What has Balder ever done for me? Why should I mourn for him?" Later on, it came to be believed that that giantess was Loki in one of his disguises. And when Loki's part comes to be known in this adventure, the gods bind him, and they tie him up with the entrails of one of his own child. They tie him down forever, and they have a huge venomous snake which keeps dripping venom on his face for eternity. His wife sits beside him and catches the venom in the basin, but when the basin is full and she has to empty it, he writhes in pain, causing earthquakes across the earth. Loki, once captured like this, will not be released until the last battle. And after the creation of the new world, as we saw in the last unit, Balder will once again return. Friday, too, Frigg is also memorialized in one of our days of the week. Friday is Frigg's Day. The third most important member of the Aesir was Thor, the god of the hammer, the god of thunder, the god of storms. He may have been in some ways the equivalent of Zeus as the wielder of lightning bolts, But in Norse myths, Thor is not the brightest of the gods. He is dauntless, he is unflinching, and for many ages he kept Asgard safe from attack, fighting giants and monsters, and especially his inveterate enemy, the serpent coiled under the sea. Because of his connection with storms, he was also the god of rainfall, and hence the protector of communities and of the agriculture which sustained them. So he was a popular and much-loved god. And then there are many, many myths about the ways in which he protects Asgard, and as many myths about his prodigious feats of eating and drinking. In one, he and Loki are invited to the house of a giant, where they are challenged to some bouts, some contests. In the very first one, Thor is invited to drink from a huge drinking horn and to see how much of this he can drink. After 3 great draughts, he just barely has taken the level of liquid down below the rim, and so he seems to have failed at that effort. Second, he is asked to lift a cat off the floor. He tries with all of his might and manages just with immense effort to lift one paw off the floor. Then the third item, he is asked to wrestle with an old woman, and although they wrestle for a long time, he cannot throw her, she eventually throws him. It turns out later these are all tricks, and the fact that Thor did as well as he did at these tricks suggests some of his immense power and some of the reasons why he has earned so much respect among people and the gods. The first trick, the one of the drinking horn, was set up because the tip of that drinking horn was actually in the ocean. And so what Thor was being asked to do was to drink the ocean dry. And he drank so much with his 3 draughts that he actually made the level of the oceans fall to that of ebb tide and frightened everybody who noticed what was going on. The cat turns out to be the great world serpent. And just by lifting that one paw off the floor, this is an immense, immense achievement. And when he got that paw off the floor, the entire world tilted and trembled. And so once again, although he fails, it was a great feat that he achieved in getting this far. The old woman whom he wrestled with and could not defeat was really old age, who defeats everyone. So it turns out that even though Thor seems to have flunked his tests, he terrified his host with his strength. And so down through history, Thor was always a much honored god whose hammer adorned a lot of homesteads and a lot of graves. He too has a day of the week. Thursday is Thor's Day. There had been a long battle between the Aesir, the sky gods, and the Vanir, the earth gods, which the Aesir won, but then the peace allowed them to live side by side in Asgard. Maybe, as we said, this marks a kind of shift from earth-centered religion to one dominated by sky gods, which is perhaps parallel to the shift from Uranos to Cronus to Zeus. The 2 most important of the Vanir, the earth gods, were Freyr and his sister Freya, who must at one time have been a goddess and goddess of fertility. Their symbol was the golden boar, and although the Vanir were gods of peace, a lot of warriors wore boars on their helmets for protection. We remember Beowulf does that. Freya, the goddess half of this twin pair, is often pictured in myths as randy and promiscuous, having relationships with dwarves and other gods and Odin and even with her brother. Behind her story must lie a vegetation myth, which we'll look at in our next 2 lectures, in which she represents the earth's fertility and hence the fertility of the entire kingdom. In those myths, her consort always dies at the end of each season to be replaced by a new consort. And in fact, that's what happens in this one. Freyr does in fact die in his myth, and his place is taken by a series of good kings who bring fertility to their kingdoms. H.R. Ellis Davison, in a book called Gods and Myths, the Viking Age, says that despite the fact that agriculture could never be quite as powerful in a northern country like this, that the Vanir nevertheless were really, really important gods, and the entire community, of course, rests on what they can achieve. She says this about these agricultural gods of the Norse. She said, "The gift of life brought by the Vanir was mysterious, and it was a mysterious and impalpable one, but it was essential to men. Without it, good fortune and victory and prudent rule were worthless and empty things. For if the crops failed and children died, or there was no quickening in the womb, the community was doomed and without hope." Every pagan settlement has thus paid some service to the fertility powers who possess the ultimate say as to its future, and the people of the North were no exception. The Vanir, not quite as powerful as the Aesir, the sky gods, but that's probably because this was a warrior culture. The joker in the deck, the Norse deck, is always Loki, the trickster, the deceiver. He causes an immense amount of trouble in Asgard, but he also helps the gods get out of it. He's a constant companion of Thor and Odin, but he's also the father of monsters, Fenrir the wolf and the great sea serpent who will destroy Asgard, and he is also the father of Hel, the goddess of the land of the dead. He will lead the giants against the gods at Ragnarok, but also in one of his shapeshifts as a mare, he gave birth to the eight-legged steed that Odin rides everywhere. We can't even be sure in myths whether Loki is a giant or a god. It's impossible to pin him down. We'll get back to him again in Unit 4 on tricksters. Thus, we can see that the Norse pantheon is more complicated than the Greek one. It reflects both the harsher conditions in which they live, and also it reflects the values of what was essentially a warrior culture. These were a warrior peoples for whom the reason for existing was battle, and all of their values grow out of this: honor and courage and loyalty and strength and dedication and honesty. And their pantheon, in its way, reflects their values as clearly as the Greeks do theirs. Next time, we will spend our lectures talking about goddesses in their most important manifestations. The next four lectures will deal with goddesses, in fact, and ways in which they changed over time. Next time, we'll take a look at 3 myths from Vietnam, from North America, and from Africa, showing the importance of goddess in early cultures.